Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me all right. It's Peter Weigers speaking, and thank you, everybody, for joining this celebration of the life and work of Reginald Haggar. It was brought about, this event, by the strange times we're living in, the COVID situation, clearly, and having to make rearrangements of our normal annual plans. And in the course of the event, please be thinking about any questions you might like to ask at the end of the panel that we've assembled to try to address any points that might arise. Again, throughout the presentations, there'll be many thank yous issued, but I wanted to start with the main one, which is to our treasurer, Deb Skinner, whose idea this was in the first place, and who's also done most of the work and the planning for it. So it's already a huge credit to her, and even more so if it all goes well. If it goes pear-shaped, then I'm guessing it's going to be probably my fault. So I take full responsibility for anything that might be a bit clunky starting now. The pre-recorded presentations start with myself looking at his paintings and drawings, with Mr. Haggar talking about his methods and subjects on film from the 1970s, which we're very, very lucky to have, and that's thanks to Ray Johnson and the Staffordshire Film Archive for starters. Then after that, Deb, who is also the engagement officer for the Raven Mason collection with Arts Kiel, will focus on his Mason research and his publications before going on to show items from the Haggar collection at the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery. There'll be more clips of films interspersed, with Reginald Haggar surveying the potteries landscape that inspired him. And so that's going to be something that you'll see along the way. And finally, as I say, a panel has been drawn from our committee members and former curators at the City Museum and Art Gallery, as it was. And the panel will attempt, as I say, to answer any questions or points you might have on the work of this very influential man. So if I'm able to, I'd like to introduce briefly the panel members who are on camera. So Deb Skinner, I've already mentioned. If I think I'm looking for little red lines. So it looks as though they're on Pat and Jeff, actually. There's Deb Skinner. So she's with us. Pat and Jeff were both curators at the, Pat and Jeff Halfpenny, curators at the City Museum and Art Gallery, and were great friends of Reginald and Dorothy Haggar too. And not on camera, but at the end of a telephone, when we come to the panel questions, is Dr. Chris Wakeling, who will also be able to talk a bit about issues on his teaching methods, for example. So beyond that, we'll all try to keep those points that you might have coming and answered as best we can, and hope that it's going to be enjoyable and the sort of experience you'll be happy that you actually joined. I don't think I can do any better than to perhaps suggest to anybody my sort of age, do you remember somebody saying to you at some point, "Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin." Well, are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Hello, I'm Peter Weigers, and as chair of the Reginald Haggar Memorial Lecture Committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you and introduce you to the legacy of a major figure in North Staffordshire's history during the 20th century. After his death in 1988, part of the Haggar estate was used to set up, in his honour, an annual free lecture series at the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery in Stoke-on-Trent. And since 1990, many notable guest lecturers have given wonderful talks there on a subject of their choice, covering a breadth of cultural interest that reflects the wide-ranging involvement and influence of Reginald Haggar himself. Sadly, this year's lecture has had to be postponed to 2021, as the COVID-19 virus continues to disrupt so many public and educational events around the world. But in the meantime, we wanted to keep the Haggar achievements visible, if only via our different presentations on his work and importance using the media available to us. So, here are some of my personal views on his drawings and paintings, focusing on the 8 works I've chosen for this brief survey. First of all, though, I will let Mr. Haggar speak for himself about his arrival in the Stoke-on-Trent of the 1920s. We are very lucky to have filmed interviews from the 1970s to show you, thanks to the Staffordshire Film Archive. And at the end of my presentation, I will conclude with some more film footage on his early training and his working methods in watercolour. So I hope you enjoy this spotlight on the life and work of one of this region's most notable and influential figures, Reginald Haggar.
Well, it's not easy to say why one paints the potteries. I came to the potteries with a great dislike for it, and it took quite a long time before the atmosphere of the potteries took hold of me. But I think the things that really make it so attractive to a painter is the quality of the atmosphere and the unusual skyline, which is a feature of the hill towns which stretch out along this particular area. The features are, of course, the bottle ovens, now far fewer than they used to be, and they're so varied in shape and contour, and these, with the hovels of factories, particularly in the Longton area, give it a picturesque quality which I think you can find nowhere else in this country. I can't see, in fact, any of the modern factories attracting the artist in quite the same way that old Samson Smith's or the Bluebell pottery or the Garfield in Longton, or even, for that matter, the now nicely tidied up factory of the Gladstone.
To begin with, we're in 1932, and here's a drawing, a self-portrait in a mirror, of the 27-year-old artist. He's already in Stoke-on-Trent, and he's working as art director at Minton's. He's got a strange, rather inscrutable expression, and I think that it's partly because of his interest in the distortion he can see in the dressing table mirror. But it's accompanied by the trademark concentration, which he often showed when at work. Some of the lightening factors, I think, are the little offshoots of hair either side of his fringe, which give him, perhaps unintentionally, a rather impish look. And many of you who remember him will also remember his quite long, unfashionably lank hair into old age that he seemed to prefer. Perhaps this is just the start of that. This is Wind and Rain at Dale Hall Farm, Suffolk, 1935. So it's only 3 years later, but by now he's become head of the Stoke School of Art, which actually was just across the road from Minton's. It's a reminder partly of his roots near Ipswich, where he was born, because that's where the Suffolk farm is, but noticeably it is stylized, particularly with the weather conditions, I think, and that's a sign of the Art Deco times he was living in. And also it's evidence of his pottery design interest from this period. So you can see the same sorts of stylized trees, for example, on his pottery designs. This wonderful landscape of St Ives in 1938 is evidence of his many visits with his wife to the southwest coast, all the way through, in fact, to the 1960s. So it was a favourite area for them to go and for him to start sketching and painting. It also shows his early style, which you'd have to say is more of a detailed drawing with watercolour added afterwards. And that, I think, is a legacy of his early training as an illustrator and designer. Only later on did he loosen up his technique and paint much more freely in watercolours. So it is indeed a true watercolour, but it's more characteristic of his early work. From 1949, I've picked this pen and ink drawing, and it's significant because it's a striking design which was to be used for an important exhibition about the changing potteries landscape, which was being held at the City Museum and Art Gallery at the time. Some of his early work had included illustrations also for books on football and music, as well as costume designs. So he was comfortable in working in that medium, as well as as a landscape artist. By now, he's left his art school job at Burslem, the last one he held in the art schools, to devote all his time to painting, freelance lecturing, and writing about art and ceramics. So big changes in his own life had happened at this time, and often he was really quite hard up and had to sell books to make ends meet at times. So it was a brave decision that he took, but showed his confidence in his own abilities as an artist and writer, and indeed lecturer. This self-portrait with black grapes of 1961 is a very striking work, and I think arguably his best. You can see his anxious expression, the sombre but glowing colours with thick black lines, almost in places like a stained glass window, particularly the landscape reflected in part of the mirror. And the atmosphere is underscored by the reality of a recent tragedy that he and his wife suffered, a serious road accident outside their house, which left his wife seriously impaired. And she's in the bedroom where he's making this painting, so it could hardly have been a more important or personal work for him. The Gordon Pottery, Tunstall, 1969, I've chosen just as one of many pictures that depict the bottle ovens, characteristic of this North Staffordshire area, and also a characteristic that was becoming increasingly redundant by this time and disappearing around him. Some of the works with bottle ovens he showed in a state of decay or dereliction because, as he said in his own words, that was always something of great interest to him as an artist. It's important because in people's memories of Haggar, I guess more own or are aware of these recurring pottery kiln subjects than any of his other subjects overall. So if anybody remembers the name or the artist Reginald Haggar, this is the kind of scene I suspect they would think of first, even though it was just one of many types of work that he produced. In contrast, from around the same time, 1968, here's a rural landscape, Washing Day Ipstones, which is a village in the moorlands just above Stoke-on-Trent. And it shows he has just as much interest in these country landscapes, as indeed many artists do working in watercolours. And you have to remember that his own tradition from East Anglia and Suffolk would have been an awareness of Crome and Copman and people like John Constable very close to where he grew up. So it would have been unsurprising if he had continued to paint mainly this sort of subject. But as he said himself, he was in the end really drawn into
special qualities of the Stoke-on-Trent landscape that many would not find much of beauty in, but he in the end did, and recognised its particular atmosphere. Nevertheless, this sort of landscape reminds us that he was a founder of groups like the Society of Staffordshire Artists and later the North Staffordshire Watercolour Group, and that this would have been as likely to have been those groups' interests as a subject as his own industrial ones. And I think his style of landscape painting and watercolours is still recognisable in the work being produced in this area today. So I think his influence as a painter lasted a long time after his death. And finally, I've just picked this one, a local scene to him, Snow at Turbine Farm, Hanford, in 1968, because it was a special occasion. It was his birthday, Christmas Day, 1968, looking out of his window opposite, on the other side of the road to Stone, across to the hills beyond the River Trent and the turbine farm, and it's a snowy landscape. And he did plenty of those, both industrial and semi-rural, as in this case. But it's the technique, I think, that makes it stand out. So, as many people will know, a true watercolour will use the blank white of the paper to convey the idea of the snow. And in fact, there's more of that than there is of actual paint. It's the surrounding dabs and strokes of washy colour that rather define this snowy scene. But the fact that it's able to do that and suspend the disbelief that what you're actually mainly looking at is blank paper, you read it as snow because you have no choice, that shows the effortless skill, or so it seems, that he had to convey these sorts of subjects in watercolour. And I think it is interesting that he chose to stay with watercolour all his life, and there's very few examples, I think, of anything in oils. And I suspect that he might have been even better known beyond this area had he been an oil painter, but it wouldn't have suited him. I think it's quite clear in his development from his early days at Ipswich that he was very well attuned to the sorts of skills and imagination and vision that you have to have if you're a watercolour painter rather than working in another medium.
The rule of the school which I attended as a boy was, if you make a mistake, leave it, which was accompanied by an unwritten rule invariably carried out, that if you make a mistake you will be punished for it. Rather harsh, but induced the habit of thinking before putting pen to paper. The rule without the punitive implications is a good one for artists. The time spent in thought is equally important with that spent in applying the colours. Good watercolours are generally remarkable for economy of statement, the artist indicating his intention plainly, simply, directly, and often with surprisingly few but happily placed touches of colour. Such a picture may well be painted in a half an hour or less, because all the real labour has been done before in what may be described as hours of industrious idleness, during which the painter, having found time to stand and stare, has come to grips with his subject. Freedom and force can only be achieved by working out of doors in direct confrontation with the subject, and by drawing and painting with a brush fully charged with colour. It is best done, in my view, by painting with the board nearly vertical, holding the brush at arm's length like an oil painter. There is much to be said for this manner of painting, although it demands considerable skill and even more courage and confidence. It is also physically much more tiring, just because the artist becomes so completely involved in his or her task. Moreover, in high March winds, painting in this way becomes even more arduous and exciting. The freedom, however, which the method produces more than compensates for the effort. The oak paint method is a more considered manner of working and makes subtle shades and tones of colour. It is essentially a studio method, and in the studio one is not troubled with flies or heat or sun or wind or weather. The transparent method has an element of spontaneity, the brush being used with the fluency of a pen, and the touches of colour take on the character of calligraphy. And because of this less measured approach, transparent watercolours at their best possess an intimacy and an immediacy of appeal.
It gives me great pleasure to make this short presentation today, looking at Reginald Haggar's extensive research and the resulting publications about the Mason family and their factories and ceramics. Reginald Haggar had a career-long interest in the history of the Masons, and it was this subject that also began to interest me as a young ceramics curator in the potteries in the 1980s. I was privileged to know the Haggars and to collaborate with Reginald on exhibition projects at the then City Museum and Art Gallery, Stoke-on-Trent. After his departure from Minton's China Works in 1935, Haggar relied on teaching and lecturing and freelance work as an artist and designer to make a living. He also accepted commissions as a researcher and writer, and it was this which led to his long-standing relationship with the Goddard family, the then owners of the former Ashworth's Mason's Ironstone factory in Hanley. The bicentenary in 1952 of the birth of Miles Mason, founder of the Masons business, was the catalyst for a commissioned history of the firm. Reginald Haggar did not know at the time how deeply he would become involved with all aspects of Mason's historic productions, the factory owners' family histories, and the growing group of collectors of ceramics that became his lifelong friends. This is my copy of the Masons of Lane, Delft, given to me by Reginald, and with the dust jacket showing the Mason family portrait of about 1800, which is now in the Raven Mason collection that I curate at Keele University. Reginald Haggar was methodical in all that he did, and his approach to research included impeccable note-taking in his beautiful artist's hand, along with illustrations and drawings, filed in alphabetical ring binders. He explained to me once that if you draw something, it makes you look and remember in a way that you do not otherwise do, and I can say that I've found this to be true. Pre-digital technology meant that Reginald had to describe documents, newspaper notices, and maps into his notes, for which I will ever be grateful, as this gives a clear and immediate picture of how useful or otherwise a reference or source is. Reginald kept a complete ring binder for his research on the Masons. This represents quite a high proportion of his notes, reflecting the importance to him of this factory, and that it represented, as he described in his teaching and writing, a case study of a typical medium to large scale business in the potteries in the 19th and 20th centuries. In the pages seen here, he transcribes newspaper notices, records elements of patterns and trademarks, reproduces sections of maps of the potteries from 1802 and 1832, and records a precise technical drawing of an early 19th century Mason teapot, reminding us that he had spent some years himself as a designer and art director in the ceramics industry. Reginald Haggar's quest to discover and record the history of the Mason family and business led to a travel odyssey with Dorothy, his wife, seeking out places and recording them, not using photography, but in the way that a watercolour artist would, in watercolours. The Haggars travelled several times to what was North West Yorkshire, now Cumbria, to Dentdale, where the Masons were well-to-do farmers and landowners. Reginald found the place of Miles Mason's birth at West House, painted in 1950, and painted views of the village of Dent. In Lane Delph, in Staffordshire Potteries, the Victoria works and the house attached were still extant and recorded in watercolour in 1951. Sadly, these no longer exist. The Haggars remained in North Staffordshire throughout their long marriage, except for a short time living in Peel on the Isle of Man. The end of their lives were spent in a nursing home at Wetley Rocks, Wetley Abbey, a Staffordshire Gothic with a K, gentleman's home built by George Miles Mason, the second son of Miles and Ruth Mason, in the 1830s. Following his first book about the Masons, Reginald Haggar's research activity continued to reveal much more detail about the factories and their various owners. In the 1950s and 60s, Haggar's relationship with Keele University had become firmly established, and his extramural students were following research projects of their own. In the 1970s, one of these students was Elizabeth Adams, wife of Watership Down author Richard Adams. Elizabeth began to discover more information about the Masons and to acquire ceramic wares made by them. She was a talented researcher and writer in her own right, and Haggar and Adams became another volume of note about the Masons. Mrs. Adams had different collecting tastes, however. She mainly acquired London porcelains for her own collection, and her Masons acquisitions managed to find their way into the Haggars collection. I must also note here, in the interests of fairness, that other works about the Masons are also available, and that the richness of Masons' factory history was mined by prolific ceramics author Geoffrey Godden on several occasions. Reginald Haggar's publications are far more wide-ranging than monographs on ceramics. He produced works of reference that remained in print for many years, such as his concise encyclopedias of English and continental ceramics, and his dictionary of art terms in architecture, sculpture, painting, and in the graphic arts. My own relationship with the Haggars began when I joined the staff at the museum in Hanley, the former City Museum and Art Gallery. One of my first tasks was to manage the exhibition project, Mason, A Family of Potters, in 1982. In preparation for this, the catalogue was written collaboratively and became one of my first publications on the Masons, and one of Reginald Haggar's last. Exhibitions were a good opportunity to research and publish new information about the history of ceramics, and a series of projects with the Northern Ceramic Society and the Masons Collectors Club was highly productive. Reginald Haggar was himself a founder member, committee member and officer of both from 1972 until his death in 1988. Importantly for the museum, the Haggars made the decision to donate their ceramics collections ahead of the 1982 exhibition. And during the previous summer, Pat Halfpenny and I took a van by ferry to the Isle of Man and filled it with their precious pots. Dorothy could no longer speak following a road accident in 1961, but she could supervise the packing expertly, cook meals for all of us, and choose plenty of good wine. The most comprehensive listing of Reginald Haggar's published works was compiled by Rodney Hampson and published by the Northern Ceramic Society in 2005 at the time of a major exhibition at the Potteries Museum about Reginald Haggar, the man and his work. In 1997, I produced a bibliography of Haggar's Masons publications in collaboration with Dr. Peter Stovin, published in the catalogue of the Raven Mason collection by Keele University. Rodney Hampson was a long-standing student of Reginald Haggar's and employee of Keele University, and is himself a prolific author on the history of the potteries. Hampson's bibliography includes all the known works by Reginald Haggar, including his first work, Recent Ceramic Sculpture in Great Britain, written in 1946. A Century of Art Education in the Potteries dates from about 1953, and the vastly important section on the Staffordshire pottery industry in the Victoria County History, co-authored with Arnold Mountford, appeared in 1967. Outside the realm of art and ceramics, Reginald Haggar illustrated Percy M. Young's works, The Football Year in 1956 and 58, and Music and its Story in 1960. He was a regular contributor to the Evening Sentinel, Staffordshire Life, and Pottery Gazette, in addition to national art journals. The publications of the Northern Ceramics Society, the Masons Collectors Club, the English Ceramics Circle, and the Wedgwood Society regularly carried contributions by Reginald Haggar, and he expertly acted as editor for the NCS and the Masons Collectors Club. In the time available to me, I can only give a flavour of the value of Reginald Haggar's pioneering published work. I've benefited from this greatly in my career and from the unpublished information that is to be found in his notebooks and diaries. But most of all, I had the privilege of listening to Reginald Haggar lecturing in his inimitable way, and to have had many conversations with him that opened my eyes to the value of diligent research and methodical, accurate recording of information. Reginald was always ready to encourage young people in their work and was never haughty or above framing sensible answers to what I now realise were often simplistic questions from me. I'm indebted to the committee of the Reginald Haggar Lecture Fund for the opportunity to make this presentation, and to all donors to the Lecture Fund who allow us to continue to present lectures in Reginald Haggar's name each year.
Well, I came here in August of 1929, and it was pouring with rain when I came, and I got a very dim impression of the place, because although I only came in from London, not on the Derby line where there would have been a great many more bottle ovens, the place was extremely dirty and dark. And in fact I was met at Stoke Station by a fellow student, a local artist named Leonard Brammer, who was a native of the Potteries, and he asked me where I was going to live, and I said, I'm not going to live in this ruddy hole. And I went out on the first train, in fact, to Stone. And it's only in course of time that I've gradually moved in towards the Potteries and come to live in the Potteries itself. At that time, Stoke was a very grim place. Indeed, of the 6 towns, I suppose Stoke is the worst. It's a town without very much character. It never had much more than its factories and its railway station. And therefore it didn't create an impression with me of anything that was attractive. And one felt here was only a life that was associated either with the church or chapel, which of course was very evident, but more particularly with the major factories, of which there were only 2 important ones that impinged upon the eye, and that was the big factory of Spode, which occupied an enormous area, and Minton. And at that time, when I came to Minton to be a designer at Minton's in the first instance, although I became art director within 6 months, so Minton's then had 3 different factories on the banks of the canal: the earthenware factory, the china bank, and the old stone bank, where they made their tiles and violica and vases and ornamental ware. And throughout the whole of the old factory, one had a feeling that these belonged essentially, you know, to Victorian times, and the old traditions were upheld and maintained without alteration into the period when I came to the factory. My first impression, though, of the Potteries outside the factory was that the people of the Potteries looked so clemmed and starved, if I can use the 2 words that cover hunger and cold. They looked pinched and wan and ill. And the area had that dark, sombre look, which seemed to me almost as though I was witnessing something in a dream as I tried to recall it, because it's so totally different from the world that we know, of course, of the Potteries today. The people of the Potteries are immensely proud. I was very conscious of their pride in their craftsmanship, And you know, nobody could do it like I could do it, or my father could do it. He was better than I was in front of me. It was that kind of approach. And indeed, many of those who were working as artist craftsmen were intensely skilled people. And I don't think perhaps a generation coming into the potteries today will feel about the potteries quite the same as I did. I hated it, but I found somehow that this hate of the potteries soon resulted in a kind of love-hate relationship, until finally love triumphed over the hate, and one found oneself involved completely as part of a community, a small world. Now that world, I think, is broken down. After all said and done, the atmosphere of the potteries is not all that much different from the atmosphere outside now. It is different, but not much different. And as you look at what is happening in the potteries today, it's very much like what is happening in every other town. And the city of Stoke-on-Trent, as far as I can see, at the very end of all the transformation that's taking place, will look like any other old town instead of the little world that I particularly loved. Which had its own individuality, a world which is comprised of little towns and villages, each in rivalry one with the other, which of course gave a rise particularly to its special characteristics. I'm not sure about this, because even when I was in my hometown of Ipswich, I loved the old crumbling buildings. I liked, in other words, a sense of desolation and dereliction. And it may well be that change and decay is something which is inherent in my own nature, because, strange as it may seem, I have several sketchbooks that are completely filled up with gravestones, so that I like the rather strange world. You know, and I think it is the sense of decline and decay. It may even be the sense of decline and decay in the pottery industry, which has been a major factor in focusing attention upon the evidence of man's past in the bottle kilns and the factories. I think that possibly is the answer here.
My second short presentation today is about the ceramics collection of Reginald and Dorothy Haggar, the larger part of which is now at the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery. The collection focuses mainly on the products of the mason factories, but also includes a broader group of items from the 19th and 20th centuries that reflect the Haggars' tastes and interests and their friendships and relationships during their lifetimes. Reginald came to the potteries as a designer for Minton's in 1929. And although the Minton archive contains many of his designs, few were put into production. This was a source of some frustration, which, along with what he saw as entrenched attitudes within the industry, ultimately led to his departure. His designs ranged from many gilt border patterns in a classical style for high-end bone china tablewares, in keeping with Minton's established ranges, to patterns more in keeping with the fashion for Art Deco ceramics in the 1930s and reflecting Haggar's own illustrative style, such as this stylised border pattern and small mug with a stylised biblical scene. As a freelance designer, Haggar also produced schemes and patterns for Staffordshire tile makers who were, stylistically speaking, more progressive than tableware producers in the mid-20th century. The Haggar collection of ceramics was presented to the Potteries Museum in two stages. In 1981, when some 380 items of mason-related ceramics were transferred in advance of the exhibition of 1982, and in the late 1980s, a further group of 270 pieces was added, following Dorothy's death in 1987 and Reginald's death the following year. This second group included further mason items acquired in the 1980s, but also personal pieces that the Haggars would not have considered part of a collection as such as a well-designed table service by Susie Cooper for their own use, items by or produced under the auspices of friends and acquaintances such as Gordon Forsyth and William Rusco, and a remarkable piece of sculptural ceramics by Haggar himself, a head and torso figure of Dorothy. Dorothy was able to continue her interest in botany following her serious accident, and her collection of Spode porcelains with floral and botanical decoration was included in the bequest to the museum. Research was the central purpose of Reginald Haggar's ceramics collecting, items gathered to extend knowledge and aid comparison, rather than as an end in itself. Indeed, he could be rather scornful of the habit of collecting products of a single type or factory. Collecting should be broad-based, he maintained, and he was part of a generation of scholars of ceramic history, to whom we are now considerably indebted, as their collecting and research resulted in groundbreaking publications and exhibitions. Haggar was as meticulous in keeping records of his collection as he was with his ceramics industry research, beautifully recorded in illustrated notebooks, which are now an invaluable support to the collections held at the museum. The Haggar's assemblage of the products by the mason factories owes as much to their friends, colleagues and students as it does to their own intentions in acquiring objects. In particular, Elizabeth Adams kept up a steady flow of interesting items. Reginald's extensive research into the history of the masons' business turned to an interest in the objects they produced as evidence, the study of material culture as it would now be recognised. His extramural classes and then summer schools at Keele University, started in the 1960s, resulted in the establishment of a group of people who shared an interest in pots and the potteries. And as a gift one year, the group presented Reginald with a porcelain teapot stand with the impressed mark M. Mason, the first of many mason products that found their way into the Haggar's developing collection. Reginald's own taste and interests lay first with the largely restrained shapes and classic border designs of the very late 18th and early 19th century. Miles Mason's production mainly comprised elegant tea wares in this style and in the Chinese taste. As a wholesaler and retailer, his stock in trade from the 1780s and 90s was mainly via the East India Company and included quantities of Chinese porcelain. Mason understood the market for this, and inevitably the wares he produced as a manufacturer catered for the oriental taste of his affluent middle-class customers. Shapes based on silverwares of the same period, elegant landscape painted decoration, and border designs to match any fashionable interior decor are plentiful, along with comparable patterns from other manufacturers, all evidenced in the Haggar collection. Included are many examples of Miles Mason's porcelains from about 1800 to 1813. These early years of the 19th century were a period of innovation in the potteries, and Haggar identified the development of porcelain bodies used by Miles Mason once he had amassed a group of wares that enabled him to chart progression through shapes and pattern number sequence. The term hybrid hard paste porcelain had not been coined at the time Haggar began to notice that a greyish hard porcelain body made by Miles Mason in his early years, examples can be seen here, top right, was soon replaced by brighter, whiter bone china. Mason adopted the materials and styles of his contemporaries when he embarked on a career as a manufacturer, including the all-pervasive bone china that brought the pottery such commercial success. Haggar admired skill and creativity, but also recognised that pottery manufacture was essentially a business where trade, customers and profit were of overriding importance. Less admired by Haggar were patterns that overplayed ostentation, the exotic and use of extensive gilding. Showy, as his description of a design gave us to understand that he thought it was not an example of good taste, applied to the patterns in the lower two images from time to time, and comment of a good example of its kind was damnation indeed. Restrained shapes and border patterns predominate in the Haggar collection of Miles Mason's porcelain, and the quantity of Mason's tea wares that have survived suggests that this was a large part of the total production of the factory. A representative group of Mason's patent ironstone china ornamental wares are included, including some rare and interesting pieces made during the proprietorship of brothers Charles James and George Miles Mason. Their patent of 1813 did not come out of the blue, and Haggar recognised that Miles Mason was experimenting with different materials. The vase on the right here represents an important stage in the journey towards the patent on which a long-standing business was built. The base is white bone china, impressed M mason, with the body of the vase bolted to the base, a common practice for ornamental wares of this shape. However, the body is of completely different material, dense, heavy, grey and too thick to show translucency. The Oriental style enamel decoration is familiar from the quantities of wares that followed, but it is clear that this is an ironstone china piece which predates the patent by about 3 to 5 years. The expensively decorated vase on the left is bone china and demonstrates that Mason could compete with his contemporaries in production of luxury ceramics for the home. These ironstone china pieces from the 1815 to 1820s period represent relatively tasteful aspects of the mason's output. By this time, mass production, highly variable workmanship and some unscrupulous practices had crept into the mason's business. And this, in addition to what Reginald regarded as a decline in standards of taste and design, led him to favour the wares of the first 30 years' production over that which came later. In particular, Haggar admired the quirky and stylish decoration on a pair of small hexagonal vases of about 1815, decorated with Chinese scenes, based on the designs of painter and decorative artist Jean Pillemont. Oriental patterns became the staple of ironstone china production for nearly 200 years. As light relief from the masons, I leave you with these charming Staffordshire figures from the Haggar collection. The subjects are naive, a rural figure group with a bocage or tree background and a small figure of a deer in similar style. Both were made in the period 1810 to 25 and would be unremarkable amongst the many, many thousands of such items made by dozens of figure makers in the potteries. But these are made remarkable by their marks. Few such items bear makers' marks. So here we have the group mark Walton on the left, made by John Walton of the Burslem area, and the little figure on the right, marked Tittenser. There are a number of Tittensers in the pottery business, and it was a common local name. It was such features of ceramics, the small clues, intriguing stories and technical ingenuity, rather than the grandiose and flamboyant, that Reginald Haggar found so compelling, and that led to him becoming a collector, possibly against his better judgment.
Yes, I'm very fond of Longton in particular, and the particular place where we are standing now. And I like it because it reminds me so much of what the potteries was like when I first came to the district, close on 50 years ago now. The bottle ovens are all different in shape. These are not very large ones. One of them is very wide-necked and has a roll moulding near the top. The others have got quite marked features, rather like the reticulations that you find in old castle buildings around the necks of them, adding quite a decorative feature to the shape. One or two of them are straight cones, so that the assembly of buildings here, all very derelict, make a very picturesque grouping. Nearby, one can see a very narrow-necked decorating kiln in an adjoining passage, and one can also see a row of cottages that must have been occupied by people who worked at the factory here. Now, of course, awaiting demolition, though they've been waiting for demolition for many, many years. I've seen them becoming even more run down every time I've come. The beauty is really what the artist sees in the possibilities of the buildings. And I think even some artists have said that there is nothing really ugly, it's the light that transforms it. Actually, the atmosphere of the potteries is such that there's a grandeur and a character about these buildings which the newer factories don't really seem to possess. Well, I don't know whether it is quite so antiquated. It's not as old as all that, but then not many of the factory buildings that survive in the potteries are of very great age. And of course it has very few of, in fact, only one of its original bottle ovens, although it's one of the most beautiful that survives that you can see from any vantage point. It's a very large shape with a rather lovely tapering neck with its embellishments, and it's surrounded by a range of buildings of various heights, obviously representing different periods, with one very strong main building which hangs onto the canal, which serves as a wharf. And of course, by the canal you can see the hoist that took the materials into the building, and it's got a lovely kind of flowery bloom, as it were, from the whites and the greys of the materials which have been deposited here. So that here you have some indication of the importance of the canal to the pottery industry surviving. This is a vast acre. God's acre here is bigger than any other in the potteries, and it's a very untidy one. I dare say one day they'll come round and sift the gravestones and tidy up the church with lawns. I sometimes regret this. In fact, I've known the potteries a long time, and all these churchyards have been just a little derelict, and I can well believe the children prayed riding on the gravestones one after another, and indeed I'm sure they enjoyed themselves doing so. There is a lot of history in this churchyard. There's the graves of the Wedgwood particularly, numbers of them towards the southeast corner of the churchyard, and again just north of the churchyard as we come in from Enoch Street. There is of course quite near where we are standing, a grave which everybody, I would think, who comes to Burton sees without recognising its difference, for it faces north to south. This is the gravestone tabled grave of Margaret Lee, the Burton witch, Molly Lee.
Well, I think I'd like to say thank you to Reginald, the last speaker, and to Deb before him. I hope we're all functioning again, are we? It looks as though we're up and running, and this is the point at which I'm going to ask Deb to field the various questions that we think may have been coming in. But I'll reintroduce our panel. So Pat and Jeff Halfpenny, like Deb and myself, were former curators at Stoke-on-Trent City Museum and Art Gallery, and great friends of Reginald and Dorothy Haggar. And Chris Wakeling, who's currently revising the Pevsner Architectural Guide for Staffordshire, has been a member of our committee along with several others for a number of years now. So we're used to seeing each other at regular meetings and at the annual event, which is not normally like this, but it's good to have them on board to help answer some questions. And if I can start it off really with Pat and Jeff, how would you say you first got to know him, and what are your favourite memories of both the Haggars?
Well, I think I got to know Reg first. It was probably in the late 1960s. I was working as a receptionist at the museum, and Reg came in regularly because he was giving some lectures at the museum along with Mr. Mountford. We had an exhibition of fashion. We got a great costume collection at the Potteries Museum, and so I decided to do some drawings to go on the wall behind to liven it up. And I used some horizontal lining paper, and I'd drawn costumes from prehistory to modern day, and I'd called it From Cave to Rave. You can tell it was the 60s. And Reginald came in and took one look, and I thought, oh, I'm in trouble now. But he came over and said, who did the drawings? And I said, it was me. And he gave me a look, which I felt wasn't too harsh. And so I was very happy that he hadn't actually said they were terrible. So that was my first introduction to Reg, and I got to know him much better in the following years, because he was a regular visitor as they planned the formation of the Northern Ceramic Society, which the planning meetings were always at the museum.
Well, mine's very social. Pat doesn't drive, neither did the Haggars, so I became chauffeur and general dog's body around the house with great pleasure. It was always a delight to be with them, and they really enjoyed going out for meals, and we had many a decent meal. I well remember the Poacher's Cottage at Trentham there, just by Trentham Gardens, where we had many excellent Sunday lunches, and Dorothy was a dab hand at picking out great bottles of wine. So it went down extremely well. And Pat reminded me today of how different those times were to today. No touch and go at the supermarket. After we'd gone through the aisles and we were waiting at the checkout, Reginald would get his checkbook out and in magnificent form fill it all in and do his excellent signature and give it to the checkout lady. I thought, oh my golly, things have changed. But it was a great pleasure to know them, and the presentation just was wonderful to bring back very fond memories.
Thank you both. They're both too modest to mention that they were instrumental in making sure that Reginald and Dorothy were housed suitably when they came back from the Isle of Man in their final years, but I know that was a very important involvement. But moving on to an area we haven't really talked about, which many of you listening and watching might remember, the education side, the teaching and lecturing of Reginald Haggar. And if Chris Wakeling is there, Chris, would you like to perhaps start with your memory of how Haggar's work as a teacher developed?
Surely. Can you hear me?
Yes, that's good.
So clear line. My apologies for the fact that I'm on the phone. I first met Reginald in 1976 when I came to teach for Kiel, and he was getting too frail really to continue teaching. And he did undertake teaching after that time, but it was much more limited, summer schools and so forth. But much of his career had developed as a teacher when, as Deb said, in the 1930s, Reginald began to teach at the School of Art, Minton's, or rather the Stoke-on-Trent School of Art opposite Minton's. And he took on from there the task of being master in charge at Burslem School of Art. And through those years, obviously, the 30s and the 40s, he was teaching practical subjects, we might say, art, and to a lesser extent design more widely. And he was always, as I know from people I've spoken to, he was always a man to be very strict as a disciplinarian, ensuring that people learned to draw before they painted. But in the later years, after he left Burslem in 1945, he developed the lecturing, we might say, and he was always rather reticent, I think, as a speaker and as a teacher. But he had an eloquent voice, lovely cadences, as one of his students said to me, and nobody felt excluded, although he wasn't a man to be, how can one say, in amongst the students. Even sometimes when he was teaching practical subjects, teaching painting as he did, of course, more or less throughout his teaching life, which continued from the 30s through into the 1970s.
Thank you, Chris. Certainly, I know that one of our other committee members, Derek Tatton, who was former Warden Principal of Wedgwood Memorial College, had long associations with Reginald as well and his teaching, and through the WEA as well. And I know myself, I've seen photographs of what you might call Reginald's entourage. He seemed to, through his personality, as you say, by no means necessarily the most approachable seeming person, but he obviously had a magnetic effect on some students who remained loyal their whole lives. There may be some, I hope, listening today who might be able to contribute a memory, even if it's not a question. But that clearly was a very important part of his life. And excellent, of course, also that he was honoured at Keele University as well, so given an honorary degree for his importance to this area. And Deb, as well as Deb is fielding the questions, if you can give yourself time as well, Deb, if you want to chip in, as I will, with anything we think we can give another highlight to, then please do.
One here that I've published, it is to Chris. Did Haggar travel and lecture abroad? And if so, where?
He took students abroad on, I think, a couple of occasions, and these were, I think, in connection with the either the Keele or the Oxford University joint classes with the WA, the Workers' Educational Association, and he was very interested in those countries whose ceramics were interesting to him. So both France and the Low Countries, and he did travel there, and he made quite a bit out of those. That's to say, he benefited not only as a teacher, but also some of his publications. Not so much his great academic ones, but his book on sculpture through the ages, for instance, that has his wonderful little pen drawings of sculpture that he'd seen both in the Low Countries, I think in Rotterdam, I can't quite remember now, and at Versailles, for instance. So he was someone to grasp every opportunity and to make the most of it.
Absolutely. Well, Deb, do we have any questions from beyond?
Yes, we have a very good question about Haggar's own views of contemporary artists. And this is something perhaps, Peter, you might be able to answer?
Well, I wish I could in more detail, but I think you could gather from the clips of films that he was very forthright in his views. And I think he was generally not over impressed by contemporary developments. I don't know if Pat and Jeff have got any more views on that. I can't say as I've got anything firsthand that I recall, and he was probably too careful to not want to discourage or annoy anybody genuinely wanting to further their careers. But I didn't get the impression he was feeling that things were going in a good direction. But anyone else?
I particularly remember him walking through a gallery where we were preparing an exhibition of contemporary ceramics, studio ceramics. He was walking through that gallery before it was open to go somewhere else, and he looked around and he said in his usual, the cult of the irregular. And I think that sort of summed up what he felt. He was not against it, but it just wasn't him.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm waiting to do an exhibition of that title.
If I can jump in.
Yep, go ahead, Chris.
Thanks. I remember there were artists, Rembrandt was one of them, Turner was another, whom he greatly admired, as well as what we might call the East Anglian favourites of Cotman and Crome, and to a lesser extent Constable. And I remember in 1977 working with him with a class of students, and we were talking about Turner's work, and it was fashionable at that point to see in Turner's late paintings the origins of the ideas of the American abstract expressionist painters, people like Rothko. And I tried this idea out on Reginald, and he wasn't having any of it. He didn't really I think, have a great enthusiasm for much of what he saw in the overtly modernist world, although in his time in the 1920s, when he was at the Royal College of Art in London, he was, of course, enthusiastic and perhaps even more than that about the new ideas coming in with the vorticists and abstractics and I beg your pardon, and expressionists, and we see some of that in his own design work, as you talked about, Peter. Yes,
that's a good point. And I mentioned, I think, in an email back to Deb, that when I'd seen her presentation with the illustration of that torso, which I believe is of his wife Dorothy, it hadn't struck me before. I have seen it before, but that put me in mind of the Epstein rock drill well before that time. But it must have been very hard not to be influenced by the vorticists and the Art Deco period he came through, because I think if you are looking at his work from the other direction, from the 70s backwards, you'd find it harder to think that that was part of his work earlier. His is not exactly impressionist, his looser late style, but it certainly is a very free style of watercolor painting. And that is in itself inherently different to what we know of French Impressionism, because of course that's an oil painting method mainly, and benefiting from white canvas coming through rather than the dull traditional canvases. So some things in common, but I think people are these days, and have been for a long time, comfortable with looser impressions like the Impressionists and work like Reginald Haggar's later work, in a way that they clearly weren't over 100 years ago. So I think that is quite interesting that yes, he knew what he wanted to do, and he was very good at doing that. And in North Staffordshire in particular, in marrying that up with the subjects he chose, not surprising, he became, just as an artist, very popular, even if he'd never done anything else. But what we want to convey is the fact that he was a man of many parts within the cultural life of this area. Well, I'll shut up now and see if anybody else has got any points.
Yes, we've had a very good question, a very big question from one of our committee members, Martin Brown. I've just posted this. Would you think that Haggar felt art and industry combined well in the potteries, or were there tensions? I would jump in here a little bit. I think he felt initially that art had been abandoned in the potteries when he first arrived here. But it's like a lot of people who come to a study of the heritage and culture of the potteries. They realise that it is a deeply artistic community, and that it influences industry at a number of levels, even if you can't see it. If it superficially appears not to be here, then you just haven't scratched the surface.
Well, that's interesting. Pat and Jeff, do you want to have a go at that one?
I know that when he was at Minton's, he felt that the traditional way of developing shapes and patterns on a factory site was through the production team and not through artists and designers, and that caused a conflict because what he was designing and what the production people wanted to make were in conflict, which is one of the reasons he left Minton's. But I think he came to enjoy the work of people like Susie Cooper, who, in order to produce what she thought should be produced, had to go out and get her own factory. And so I think he realised that you couldn't just go to a traditional factory and impose modern designs on them, but in fact there were ways and means in which you could do that. Greta Marx was another person who did that, and she started her own pottery. So there were people who were able to do that, but of course it was difficult to get their things marketed, and they're that's not what people look for in Staffordshire pottery when they're buying in America. They're looking for tradition, and America was always the big market. So it was difficult really to have a profitable, long-term profitable factory.
Well, I've got a view on it. Chris, do you want to have a comment about?
You go in first, and we'll see.
Okay. Well, just off the top of my head, thinking about it, and I'm not from the potteries, so I, just like Reginald and so many others, came into it not when it was smoky, but still a kind of baffling place. But as you get to know what is done there, as in any place, I can't think of anywhere else in this country that has got an industry traditional with skills, crafts built into it, not exactly taken for granted, just as Reginald was saying himself, for people very proud, very aware of their skills. But if you see it in an artist context, almost unique in the sense that that is your livelihood. So you're not just arguing about, oh, I know what I like, or this is what I'm going to put on my mantelpiece. It's something that is fundamental to your working life and the people around you. So it can't be quite the same as, I would have thought, people's views on arts and its development elsewhere. I think a lot of people think of, or used to think of that as being somebody else's business, not theirs. But if you're working in that area, maybe there are other places. I don't know if I can't think of them, but just for its size, Stoke-on-Trent must have been, and still is to some extent, dominated by this industrial sort of processing of artistic factors that wouldn't be seen like that in any other place. I'm not expressing it very well, but I do think that is a distinctive thing about the potteries, as he brings out himself. So when he's talking about his first arrivals, it would have been a shock. And it doesn't mean to say that he was immersed in Crome and Cotman and Constable. Far from it. He might have been more immersed in his training. But no, I think it's a very particular thing about coming to be an artist in the potteries, as he did.
If I could jump in, I think I would say that the effort in the 1930s to marry the ideals of an artist with the work of industry, that was at its most intense for Reginald. And once he left in 35 and had less and less practical involvement in pottery design, I think he embarked on a process that liberated him as an artist, but put him more adrift, particularly after 45, when he ceased to be head of or master in charge of the School of Art in Burslem. He had less and less to do with the changes in the pottery industry in terms of design. And I think that it was in the 1960s and 70s probably that the pottery industry most dramatically was affected by modern design, even if it was only in terms of pattern making and so forth. But the changes came about with a firm like Colour Roll, who essentially made mugs. It was very different from the kind of effect that Susie Cooper had a little earlier, and before her, of course, Clarice Cliff. So I think that the tension that Haggar was going through in the late 20s and through the 30s was part of an international movement. It's essentially what was happening in the Bauhaus and the work that Nicholas Pevsner was exploring in his first major book on modern design, his survey of modern design and industry in Britain. In the post-war years, particularly the 60s and 70s, I think that art did influence pottery design, but it was very much more in terms of pop art and that kind of thing. So Reginald wasn't really nearly so much taken by those ideas.
Thank you. Any more, Deb?
Yes, we've had several questions about collections of Haggar's work. So I'll just publish one or two of these and read them out. Where is the best representative display of Haggar's work locally to ST5, that is Newcastle? Is there a list of Reginald Haggar's paintings and where the paintings are? I'm just going to publish one or two more. We have several of his artworks in the museum at the Brampton. He also presented 27 artworks of other artists to the museum for the octocentenary as the president of the Staffordshire Society of Artists in 1973. Do you know of any particular connections to Newcastle? Perhaps with Newcastle School of Art or the Hobbergate, so I'll publish that one as well. And there were many Reginald Haggar paintings held by the Wedgwood Memorial College. Do we know what has happened to those paintings? So those questions probably as a group, maybe, to Peter and Chris.
I don't know. Starting with the last bit, I don't actually know. I know that when I was doing the exhibitions, one mercifully while he was alive in the early 80s, and then the 100-year centenary exhibition in 2005, that the Wedgwood College ones were fairly rare because they were from, I think, the late 50s. So that there weren't many that we were available to us, and drawings, and they hadn't been looked well. They've been looked after, but I think that people didn't realise that they'd faded quite a bit. But they were still interesting enough to be worth showing, and I don't know where those have gone off the top of my head. I do think that it's likely that the majority of his works that are in public collections are at the Potteries Museum now, but because they're watercolours, like any other work on paper, it's not the done thing because of fading to put them on permanent display. So they will be occasionally on display, some of them, but otherwise you have to make an appointment, at times probably easier than these, to come in and see them. But there is a proper body of work, and you've shown a lot of it, Deb, in your presentation in the ceramics side. So there's a substantial amount there. But this would be true of any watercolour artist or anybody working on paper. You wouldn't normally find works on permanent display unless they were covered up by something in between viewings. So was there a middle part of the question I've forgotten? I think, oh, Newcastle. Yes. Certainly, there's plenty of subject matter that he included. I remember many Newcastle scenes, but in terms of a link with the Hobbergate, I don't remember that. I remember going to the Hobbergate years ago, and I'm sure they always did have a few, but, or I think they did, but I don't remember there being a special link as such, unless anyone else can think of one.
No, if I can come in, people can Google Reginald Haggar and find some pictures that are in public collections. I think there are one or two in Ipswich and one or two other places around the country. But although Reginald did exhibit, he exhibited at the Royal Academy and other places, he was a great man for selling paintings, and very often his paintings sold quite quickly. He was never dependent on a single employer for his livelihood after he left Birmingham School of Art in 1945. It was almost a point of principle for him. And there were days when the rent was due and Reginald would go out and paint a watercolour in the morning and sell it to a dealer. This is the story that I've heard, so that he had some means of satisfying his legal obligations as a tenant. And I think we have to understand through that much of his work, wonderful though it is, was not in the kind of forum where public collections were going to snap up his paintings.
No, that's true. excuse me. Yes, it's. Oh, I know what I was going to say. In fact, you're quite right, Chris. You can Google Reginald Haggar, and I think the last time I did, there are places where you can still buy his work locally, certainly today. So there are one or two specialist galleries. I think they're probably mostly in this area of the Midlands, but there might be some elsewhere. But they will go on cropping up, and they're not too expensive to own either. So I think if people like his work, and as I said in my presentation, I think many people will think of the bottle ovens first, even though they were by no means the only thing he did. But I think for a lot of people in the North Staffordshire and Newcastle potteries area, they identify those days with his paintings, even if the natives were always very aware of all the pollution and weren't by any means sorry to see a lot of the bottle ovens coming down. And as Reginald said himself, it was perhaps that act of demolition and decay that was one of the main attractors for him in the local landscape. So any more, Deb, to come?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that his painting and teaching were his sole income. Mm. He was never a man with a huge amounts of money. He didn't have any money when he was ill at the end of his life, and there was not enough money to pay for a nursing home. And Elizabeth Adams wrote to the Royal Society of Watercolour Artists because they have a fund to help watercolour artists that have fallen on hard times. And they said that he was the most deserving person who'd ever applied, because he kept up with his fees for the Royal Society of Watercolour Artists and always added a small amount to go into that fund for distressed artists. And they were only too pleased to help him. And that was what paid for him to go to the nursing home at Wetley Abbey. So I can see what Chris is saying about painting, selling and paying your bills, because that's what he did. I'm not saying that he lived poorly. When he had money, he liked to go out and eat and drink, but he was not that he had a savings or an investment account or anything like that. It was a pension and what he could make from his teaching and painting.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks for that, Pat, and thanks also for mentioning Elizabeth Adams, because her name has appeared in Deb's presentation, certainly. And as we in the committee know, she was one of the original committee members and very, very active in setting up the Haggar Memorial Lecture Fund, and was another great supporter of Reginald and Dorothy in their lifetime. So she was very committed, wasn't she, to helping, and she must have really enjoyed working with Reginald on the books that they did together. Okay, any more, Deb?
Yes, we do have a very interesting question about, this one is, did Haggar get involved in any of the political movements of the day? Political movements of his period when he was teaching and working. The only context I know of that is that he was a non-conformist preacher, so he had religious convictions, and obviously he was non-conformist, so I would say he's probably socialist alongside that, but others may know more about his political leanings.
Well, Pat or Chris, perhaps?
He was a member of a wartime committee in North Staffordshire to help support refugee children from, I've forgotten, from Czechoslovakia, possibly, maybe Hungary. I've forgotten the details now, but it's on the edge of political matters, we might say, but he was very keen to support that. I think in general he didn't wear any political leanings very strongly. It was, as I've said before, he was a rather reticent man in many personal matters, and I never heard him express any overtly political feelings, but I do know, and I share with with others, this idea that he was a nonconformist, and I think he was nonconformist in both senses of that word.
Thank you.
He told me that he was obviously a very strong nonconformist when he lived in Ipswich, and he told me that when he came to Stoke-on-Trent, he had the first alcoholic drink in his life. He was in his 20s, and he was taken to a pub in Stoke opposite the Minton factory, and he ordered a glass of sherry, which I'm sure anybody from the Potteries would have just been aghast at the thought you went to a pub for a glass of sherry. But I agree it
was a pint.
I agree with Chris. He was interested tangentially in all kinds of things, and he was interested in obscure religions, particularly as they pertained to strange things in the Potteries. Like he was interested in the Sandemanians, and there was another group that he used to follow and write about. And when I went to America on holiday, he asked me if I could just go to a chapel that had been built for these people, which I did. So he had all kinds of things that he was interested in. But I agree with Chris. I don't think he was particularly active in modern politics or modern religion.
Thanks for that then. Next one, Deb.
Well, we have one or two more questions. For example, did Dorothy ever have an independent career? That's another one for Pat and Jeff, I think.
Wow, not during our knowledge of them, but the accident, of course, was just devastating. And so it's already been mentioned by Chris about her lack of ability to speak. She could say a few things, and she was great company. She loved botany, had great interest in natural history generally. And the only thing I remember, one day something came up and she got out the phrase, "I'm stubborn, I'm stubborn." Now, that was
They were both stubborn, if I remember rightly. But I think Dorothy was Reginald's support mechanism when he was teaching and painting after he left Burslem School of Art. She drove him everywhere. She kept the books. She kept his calendar. She made all the arrangements for travel, and he was completely useless in the house. And so every Saturday when we took them shopping and then we'd go back to the house, she'd have a little set of jobs for Jeff to do, because Reg couldn't be trusted to do things like that. Like even screwing a door handle, making it tighter, or nailing a fence in the garden. So I think Dorothy was the strong one of the two, and she remained that way even when she couldn't speak very well.
Many would say Reg was by no means unique in that sense. That's all the old values have changed. Sorry, go on, Chris.
Sorry, if I could come in. Someone I knew well who knew or had met Dorothy before the accident and knew her more fully afterwards said that she was what he called an intelligent skeptic before the accident, and a little more aloof would be a word I interpreted from that, whereas she had a degree of active enthusiasm, I think, in the years when I knew her, which was only after the accident, and so there was this very profound emotional shift in her character, as far as I've come to understand it.
Thanks very much.
She also took part in amateur dramatics in Stone when they were first married, and Reginald designed costumes for the amateur dramatics.
That's right, and that was some of the what he called the opaque method that he was showing in one of those films that we had in the presentation. So yes, there's certainly evidence of that too. Next one then, Deb.
Hi, can you hear me there?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Sorry, I've just killed my screen for the moment. We're coming up to, we're actually on 4 o'clock now. So I think sadly we need to wind up the presentation and perhaps sum up what we've heard today.
Well, by all means, others do chip in, because I'm just going to be very brief in and relatively formal, remembering to try and thank everybody. But I hope that, obviously we all hope that people who have tuned into this have enjoyed it and it's brought back memories. I found, to my surprise, that I'd forgotten quite a bit about the films that, and I've been told that we had the whole of that Staffordshire archive footage at the entrance to the 2005 exhibition, but much of it I had forgotten, and it wouldn't have felt nearly as good to talk about Reginald Haggar without that. I mean, you can't do better than rekindle that voice that several speakers have referred to, and his way of presenting, as well as looking at his paintings. So it's lucky for us, certainly, and again, thanks to Ray Johnston and the archive for keeping that alive. And it may be that not many people have seen that in intervening times, but anybody who's been part of this and maybe never came across him will have learnt a lot just from that, as well as from anything that Deb and I have been able to add to it. So I hope that that has been worth it and that people have enjoyed that. But of course, I do want to thank again Pat and Jeff, who were there for actually taking part in this, and as you've gathered, knew the Haggars for a long time. To Dan Harvey and the excellent support team behind him making this technically possible from Keele University. Keele University, Arts Keele and the Raven Mason Collection too deserve our thanks in making this happen. And also the support of committee members, some of whom you've heard from today, but all our members have been very supportive about this and come up with ideas and encouragement. And again, and particularly Ben Miller, you've seen referred to in Deb's presentation, making possible that video of work from the collection. So a lot of people have actually put time into to make this possible. We didn't know we were going to be doing this, and it's quite different really from what we try to put together every year with a different speaker on a different subject. That may be not a bad thing to actually contemplate, looking back, as I said at the outset, of these very strange times. This feels like it's making the most of what we've been forced into, and I think perhaps when people look back on 2020, that's the sort of thing, not just in this arena, but many others, that will have actually opened a door that might otherwise have remained closed. So, would anybody like to add anything? Have I missed any thanks to anybody? You always feel as though you have.
Thank you to everybody for questions. Sorry that there are a couple that we couldn't get round to, a couple that I think we couldn't give a very certain answer to, and a couple that I think other answers had covered. But thank you everybody, and all of the thanks that you're sending in now. We really appreciate it.
Well done, folks.
Yeah. So thanks again, everybody, the team here, and all of you out there. And who knows, what will we be doing it next year? In a way, let's hope not. But we want to go on to go back to, if you like, what we're used to doing, and that we hope is the legacy for Reginald Haggar. It's because what we say at his actual lectures quite often is you picture him sitting in the front row, by no means easily amused, or he would be critical, and Pat summed it up well with his harumph. But he'd be there, wouldn't he? He'd be there, and he would be glad to have that sort of legacy. So let's hope we can continue with that from 2021 around this time.
I'd be failing in my duty as treasurer to not mention the fact that we haven't been able to do a cash donation, obviously this year, but we're going to show a closing slide that's got the bank details for the fund, or my email address if you wanted to contact me to make a donation. It would be great if you wanted to donate to the fund so we could continue this kind of event, and live maybe in the future. Thank you.